Like most creative people, I'm a bit of a risk taker. One of the earliest risks I took started with a guy that I met in an elevator by chance in Brooklyn. The next day, we ran into each other at the bus stop. We got to talking, and we ended up blowing off our plans and spending the day at the museum. It was only a couple of months later that we ended up driving across country to come here to Pasadena and attend the Art Center together. This adventure could have turned out to be a complete disaster, but instead it turned out to be a major turning point in our lives. I discovered a whole new field of design as it was emerging only in California, and I became a pioneer in the field of user experience. Now I work at Google as a design director, and my husband, you know, the guy I met in the elevator in Brooklyn by chance 30 years ago, he's a virtual reality artist at Facebook. But it wasn't just chance. What looked like risky, impulsive decisions were actually creative, intuitive decisions. Researchers say that what we think of as intuition is at its heart highly developed pattern recognition, and that those that have never faced negative outcomes or those that have never failed have a critical gap in the body of experience that intuition is based on. So we all know that intuition is required to navigate new and uncharted territory. That's why many venture capitalists won't even invest in a new enterprise if the founder hasn't undergone failure, because it's only through doing things that don't work that a person can cultivate intuition, start to recognize patterns and see warning signs and make smart course corrections. I've worked in the Bay Area since 1992, before the days of angel investing, before the internet was a viable commercial platform, before there were college programs to teach students how to build interfaces for software. And that's just to say that I grew up in a high-risk environment as a professional. I've lived that fail fast and learn experience every day for over 20 years. And as a result, my wheelhouse as a design leader is solving big, ambiguous problems that have no apparent path to an answer. So how do I lead teams through this kind of ambiguity? Often I use what's called design thinking, because it assumes that there are solutions to ambiguous problems, and it helps teams unpack those big problems and think in unconventional ways to get to solutions quickly. This agility to solve design problems and meet business goals consistently, it earned me a seat at the table. By 2015, I was a vice president of research and design for a Fortune 1 retail company. I had learned the language of business, and I had elevated the function of design to a strategic level. But the funny thing is that once I got there, I realized that my voice as a creative, intuitive thinker just wasn't as relevant there, and many times really just wasn't welcome. I was spending my days in back-to-back meetings, making decisions based on pre-packaged slideshows. I was traveling internationally to be a steward to the function of design that I was building. Essentially, I had become more of an executive than a design leader. Imagine working so hard for so many years to get to the top of your career, only to realize it just wasn't as rewarding as you'd think it would be. But then something completely disruptive happened. A rare chance came my way. I wasn't really even looking for a new job when I had coffee with the CEO of a new startup. I remember I was looking all over this coffee shop for the CEO person, getting impatient, and then out of the corner of my eye, I see this woman riding up on a bike. It turns out that was her. That was the CEO. She was a woman. And as I learned later, a legend in Silicon Valley. She was entering her 60s and spinning up her third startup without even flinching. She had all this depth in engineering and in building innovative businesses. But we were having coffee that day because she had a gap in her leadership team. She needed someone to come in and build her product management and design team. And when she was describing the kind of design leader she was looking for, it was like she was describing me. Intuitively, I was compelled to pursue this opportunity. But logically, it would mean leaving the security I'd left for my family behind. I mean, I was still paying student loans in my 40s, and I just didn't have the courage to pursue this opportunity. I remember talking with my husband and saying, you know, since you just started at a startup, I have to be the responsible one. I mean, someone has to have a real job. We can't raise our 2 kids and both be working at startups. And I remember he said to me, Sara, you're the only person in this room that's saying that. And when I heard that I was the only one holding myself back, I really felt challenged to go after what I wanted. And then I realized this big problem of where to take my future, I could flip the design thinking methods that I use at work and apply them to my life. So I asked a friend who was out of town for a long weekend if I could use her house. And I packed up my design thinking toolkit. Post-it notes, Sharpie pens, tape, dots to vote with. And I set out to run a 3-day sprint to tackle this problem of where to take my career. In design thinking, we use a critical question that always starts with how might we? In order to encourage divergent thinking and delay judgment and be more open to new ideas. So what was the question that would lead me forward? It was how might I align my career and my purpose? So I became a participant observer in a research study of my life. On Post-it notes, I wrote down all the pain points I'd experienced in my career, and I put them on a timeline made of tape. And then I used dots to identify all the points in that timeline where I really grew and I thrived. At the end of this exercise, I realized that the next phase of my career would be about working closely with teams again, being part of and being present for that moment when ideas just click. I realized this was my opportunity. This was my chance to align my purpose in my career. So, my next chapter began. I stepped into this new environment after only 2 weeks between jobs, and the stark contrast in realities was almost paralyzing. At a startup, you have 0 ramp-up time and a very short runway to envision a product, build it, launch it, prove value, and pivot to do the next thing. The pace is intense, and the constant uncertainty can be daunting. And if that wasn't enough, I was switching from designing consumer software to tackling the complexity of building enterprise software. I was taking on the leadership role for not just research and design, but also for product management. My work environment was so unstructured that I really started spinning, and doubt turned into fear, and things that used to be easy for me to decide just weren't easy anymore. In this new environment, everyone was doing things differently than I knew how to do them. It was incredibly disorienting. At home, bills stacked up unopened, my gas and water got turned off. My kids needed me, and I felt really guilty because I wasn't there for them. And ultimately, I had to get my bearings about me. At some point, I realized that I had to stop struggling, and I had to grab a hold of my reality. I mean, it was clear to everyone that was around me that I was struggling. And in an act of empathy, my CEO sent me a video of an engineer who had learned to ride a bike backwards. It's a backwards brain bike, so it doesn't really go backwards. The handlebars have gears in them so that it works opposite of what you learned. You turn the bike to the left, it goes to the right. You turn it to the right, it goes to the left. And this engineer took this experiment on the road and traveled the world to demonstrate this neural phenomenon. It was so powerful to watch all these people ride this bike for the first time. In each case, they got up to the bike, they got on, but the minute they started to pedal, they'd put their foot on the ground to keep themselves from falling. That's just how deeply ingrained that algorithm is that makes balance and forward motion on a bike possible. "This is how you must feel," she said. And for the first time in a long time, I felt understood. But even more importantly, the message in the engineer's experiment was profound for me at that point in my journey. The algorithm in your brain that makes riding a bike automatic, it's so deeply ingrained that you don't even think about it until you try to ride a bike differently, which seems impossible at first. But this engineer was able to demonstrate that he could reset his brain to unlearn that deeply ingrained algorithm. It took him 8 months of falling and getting back up, but in the end, he was able to prove that he could rewire his brain to ride a backwards brain bike. At this point, it was clear to me that my fear of failure was distorting reality. And I remembered that one of my best friends told me that fear, F-E-A-R, is just fantasy experienced as reality. Fear can feel very, very real, but it's not real. It's just the fantasy of something going wrong. And I reflected on that as I thought about all of the worst case scenarios and the worries flying around in my head. So I thought, if this engineer could relearn how to ride a bike that worked differently than what he was used to, then I could relearn how to be a designer in an environment that I was not used to. This backwards brain bike metaphor empowered me to get out of a fearful mindset and access my creativity so that I could adapt and move forward. So as I contemplated on that, I decided I'd do things differently. Instead of avoiding risk, I invited risk. I opened up the design process to the entire company. I got engineers from interns to architects to take part in design sprints and play an active role in envisioning the product we build. I insisted that we all go out into the field and we observe the attitudes and the behaviors of the people we were designing for. I didn't create fully rationalized presentations to sell to our stakeholders. We worked directly with our founders and our engineers. We debated the merits of ideas in real time, not in scheduled meetings. We built the product together. And in the end, in each of our own ways, we all learned to adapt and ride that metaphorical bike differently. Whether it's in my design practice or it's in my personal life, I see growth as a cycle. Risk exposes us to vulnerability, and with safety stripped away, authenticity is revealed. Without taking risks, we avoid vulnerability. And without vulnerability, we can't expose our authentic selves to rise to new challenges. The value of the risk of failing big is that the scope of the fall shatters all past patterns of knowing. And if you can learn to adapt, it not only changes what you think you know, it changes who you think you are. The person you are after the fall is significantly different than the person you were before. It's not just that the patterns change, your capacity to recognize patterns has been transformed. T.S. Eliot said, "Only those who will risk going too far can possibly find out how far one can go." How far do you want to go? If someone were to make a sketch note of my life so far, it would look something like this. If you knew you had the power to design the life that you want for yourself, what would your sketch note look like? And what are you willing to risk to get there? Who are the people in your life that will push you out of your comfort zone? Because when you're fully engaged in living, you will court failure. Embrace it. Design your way through it. Trust your intuition and see how far you can go. Thank you.